In 1973, investigators in Washington requested something surprisingly simple from inside the White House: a single audio tape. It was supposed to contain a recording from the Oval Office, one meeting between President Richard Nixon and his chief of staff, captured just 3 days after the Watergate break-in. People believed that tape could help answer the biggest questions of the entire investigation. What did the president know, when did he learn it, and what did he intend to do next? But when the tape was finally played, it didn't deliver the clarity everyone expected. Instead, it delivered a silence that spoke louder than words. In the middle of that crucial conversation, there was a long blank stretch, about 18.5 minutes, where the sound was simply missing. In place of voices and sentences, listeners heard a dull buzz and a wash of static, like a curtain pulled across the most important part of the story. It quickly became clear that this wasn't an ordinary technical glitch. The recording had not failed on its own. Someone had erased that section and left behind an audible scar. Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, said it happened by accident while she was handling a phone call, suggesting it was a simple mistake made in a busy moment. Yet later analysis by audio specialists pointed in a different direction. The erased portion appeared to be removed in many short bursts, not one single slip of a finger. That detail mattered. It suggested careful, repeated manual action rather than one brief mishap. No one in the White House could provide a completely satisfying explanation of who removed those minutes or exactly why. And that uncertainty created its own kind of headline. If the missing sound had contained information about how the administration planned to manage the crisis, then the gap itself became part of the story. In a case built on records, timelines, and proof, the absence of a record became a powerful symbol. It left the public with an unavoidable question. When the truth becomes inconvenient, who decides what remains and what disappears? From the beginning, Watergate revealed the intense lengths people were willing to go to protect authority and maintain control. The White House had a secret recording system that captured a wide range of conversations near the president, an attempt to preserve a detailed account of decision-making at the highest level. But the moment those tapes shifted from being helpful to being risky, the official record itself became vulnerable. And if something could be altered even inside one of the most secure and carefully managed buildings in the country, it raised a larger issue that went beyond one administration or one controversy. How often is history shaped not only by what happens, but by what is later edited, delayed, or quietly kept out of public view? The erased tape became one of the most famous moments of the Watergate era, but it wasn't an isolated event in the long life of this building. Over more than 2 centuries, the White House has been the stage for emergencies, private struggles, unexpected intrusions, confidential projects, and moments when the public story and the internal reality didn't match perfectly. On television, it can look like a clean, calm symbol: bright rooms, formal ceremonies, controlled speeches, and carefully framed images. But in practice, it is more like a living museum of pressure, where major decisions, personal burdens, and sensitive episodes often exist side by side. To understand how deep that pattern goes, it helps to begin near the earliest years, back when the White House nearly vanished from the map altogether. In August 1814, during the War of 1812, British forces moved into Washington after defeating American troops at Bladensburg. What followed was one of the most dramatic days the city had ever experienced. Across the capital, government buildings were targeted and set on fire. When the soldiers reached the president's house, they gathered furniture into piles and lit it. The flames spread quickly through wood and paint. Heat damaged stone, roofs gave way, floors collapsed, and the structure was left exposed. By the next day, the home of the president was a hollowed-out shell, open to the sky. Even as smoke rose from the ruins, clerks and residents rushed to protect what they could. They grabbed government records, state papers, account books, and official documents. They loaded carts, moved items away from danger, and tried to keep the essentials from being lost. Some important materials were saved, while others disappeared in the confusion of a city in crisis. That moment planted an early theme that would return again and again. When pressure hits this house, what survives often depends on speed, secrecy, and imperfect human choices. There was serious talk about abandoning the burned structure and even relocating the capital. But leaders ultimately chose to rebuild in the same place. They kept sections of surviving stone walls where possible, repaired what they could, and covered the exterior with thick white paint. From the outside, the visible damage faded. The building became presentable again. Yet everyone who worked on the reconstruction understood the truth beneath the surface. This landmark had already been tested once, and it had already broken once. If you stand before the White House today and see the bright, familiar façade, it's worth remembering that it represents a decision, to rebuild on top of ruin rather than start somewhere else. That choice created an early precedent: restore the symbol, steady the public image, and move forward, even if the past remains just under the paint. Fire returned more than once. In 1866, a serious blaze damaged the conservatory. Decades later, on Christmas Eve in 1929, smoke poured out of the West Wing. A fire in the executive offices spread through hidden spaces, attics and walls, damaging the working core of the presidency before firefighters finally contained it. President Herbert Hoover watched nearby as crews fought the flames where his staff handled daily operations. Once again, the place designed to project stability and strength looked unexpectedly fragile. Each time, repairs followed. Congress funded restoration. The public-facing image returned to normal. From a distance, it looked as if nothing had changed. But people inside the building understood that the real story was always more complex than the clean photos suggested. A pattern started to appear. Visible damage triggers rebuilding, and rebuilding is followed by a calmer, simpler narrative for the outside world. Then, in the late 1940s, a different kind of danger emerged. One that didn't arrive with smoke or soldiers but with time itself. By then, the White House was old and had been remodeled repeatedly. Newer beams, added rooms, heavier objects, and altered layouts had placed demands on the structure that early builders never anticipated. Staff members felt floors tremble slightly underfoot. They heard ceilings creak. Some people joked about ghosts, but the reason was much more practical. The building's internal framework was weakening. In 1948, Margaret Truman was playing the piano in a sitting room on the second floor when something alarming happened. One of the piano's legs broke through the floor and crashed down into the ceiling of the room below. It wasn't just an embarrassing mishap, it was a warning. Engineers were brought in to inspect the building, and what they found was serious: rotted beams, cracked supports, and ceilings that had sagged by inches. Their conclusion was hard to ignore. The White House was at risk of major structural failure. Here was the most famous home in the country, a symbol of leadership and endurance, facing the possibility of literally falling apart. President Harry Truman worried about safety, of course, but he also worried about perception. It was an election year. If the public heard that the White House was collapsing, critics could turn it into a metaphor, a headline, or a punchline about the state of the administration. At first, officials tried to keep the alarm from sounding too loudly in public. The full severity was softened. Only later did many Americans learn how close the building came to a genuine disaster. And that moment, an iconic building quietly struggling behind the scenes, raises a broader question that fits with everything that came later. When the institution is under strain, how much of the full reality reaches the public immediately, and how much is filtered through image management? In the end, the Truman family moved to Blair House across the street. From 1949 to 1952, the White House interior was essentially gutted. Only the exterior walls remained. Inside, workers installed a new steel frame and rebuilt floors, rooms, and internal supports from the ground up. When the work was complete, the rooms looked familiar again, recognizable, traditional, and polished. But behind the plaster and paint was an entirely new skeleton. The transformation was enormous, yet the public presentation remained as calm as possible. A national symbol was rebuilt in an extreme way, while the story outside stayed controlled and steady. The building survived its structural crisis. But the same careful transparency was not always applied when the weakness was human rather than architectural. In October 1919, President Woodrow Wilson suffered a major stroke inside the White House. The effects were severe: partial paralysis and serious difficulties with speech and vision. For a time, his condition was life-threatening. His doctor, Cary Grayson, and his wife, Edith Wilson, decided that as little information as possible should reach the public. Edith Wilson began controlling access to almost everything that reached the president. She decided which memos he would see and which would be withheld. She met with cabinet members and lawmakers on his behalf. Messages and instructions were conveyed in ways that allowed the government to continue functioning, yet without fully explaining the president's real condition to the nation. Edith Wilson later described her role as a caretaker managing matters while he recovered. Critics at the time, and later historians, argued that it effectively created an unelected center of decision-making. For roughly a year and a half, the country did not have a fully active president in the ordinary public sense. And at that time, there was no clear constitutional procedure that spelled out exactly how to handle a severely disabled leader. Congress was not formally told the full truth in a direct, transparent way. The public heard that the president was tired and needed rest. As you picture that private sick room inside the White House and the quiet control of documents outside the door, You can decide what you believe that episode represents: a protective approach during a medical crisis or a serious limitation on the public's right to know who was truly making decisions. Wilson's case shaped a wider habit of managing presidential health in carefully curated ways. Franklin Roosevelt lived with major mobility limitations and often used a wheelchair, but public images were staged to emphasize strength and confidence. His serious heart issues in later years were known to a small circle. John F. Kennedy endured chronic pain and significant medical challenges, yet the public image remained youthful and energetic. Over time, the expectation grew that a president must always appear steady and well, even when reality was more complicated. And once you understand that pattern, even the most polished photos from the White House can carry an unspoken question: what is outside the frame? Alongside hidden human vulnerability grew an entire physical system designed for unseen survival. Spaces built to protect leadership during external threats. During World War II, with fears of air raids, a hardened shelter was constructed beneath the East Wing. Over time, that space became the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, a secure bunker with heavy doors, reinforced walls, specialized ventilation, and protected communication lines. Only a limited number of officials ever see it. It exists for moments when leaders cannot safely remain on the main floors, when the public-facing building is too exposed. Nearby, under the West Wing, another vital complex took shape. The Situation Room opened in the early 1960s to give presidents a secure environment to track crises. It has been upgraded and expanded multiple times over the decades. In moments of international conflict, major security incidents, or urgent overseas developments, senior officials often gather around tables in those underground rooms, studying screens, maps, and intelligence updates. On the street outside, the White House can look still and quiet. Few can see the intense decision-making taking place below ground. On September 11, 2001, senior officials were rushed into protected spaces as hijacked planes struck targets on the East Coast. Leaders watched events unfold in real time and spoke with military and security officials while making urgent choices. The public saw television coverage and brief statements, but many of the most critical conversations happened out of sight, in rooms designed precisely for that purpose. Knowing this, it becomes easier to understand how modern leadership can operate in layers: the visible building above and the hidden command spaces beneath. Secret spaces can protect leaders, but they also make it easier for sensitive decisions to remain distant from immediate public scrutiny. And once secrecy becomes normal, it can expand into other areas, especially when officials believe they are acting under pressure, urgency, or exceptional circumstances. During the Iran-Contra controversy of the 1980s, a small group of officials within the Reagan administration used National Security Council offices near the White House to run a covert effort. They helped arrange the sale of military equipment to Iran and directed some of the proceeds toward supporting the Contra forces in Nicaragua, despite congressional limits on that kind of support. When the situation began to unravel and inquiries intensified, staff members moved quickly to remove traces of what had happened. Marine Officer Oliver North, a key figure on the NSC staff, fed related documents into shredders. His secretary, Fawn Hall, later acknowledged assisting in hiding and removing files, including transporting papers out of the building so they could be destroyed elsewhere. Investigators later described a process in which official records were altered, removed, or eliminated. And once again, the most important detail was the location. These weren't distant actions in some unknown warehouse. They were close to the heart of the White House complex itself, near the very place where a nation expects its records to be preserved. Years later, even after hearings and formal reviews, parts of the timeline remained unclear in the public mind, partly because key materials were no longer available. It demonstrated a sobering truth about information. People who control the files often control what is remembered, what is proven, and what remains uncertain. Watergate and Iran-Contra are usually described as political controversies, but they were also controversies shaped by the building itself. The White House as a place provided tools, cover, and a sense of insulation. It gave some people the confidence to believe that normal rules could be managed differently within those walls, at least for a while. Not every sensitive episode involved documents and operations. Some involved personal conduct and private choices that collided with public expectations. In the early 1920s, President Warren Harding used the White House as a lively social center. He played poker with friends, and accounts from that era described gatherings that were not always aligned with the strict public rules of the time, including the Prohibition era's restrictions. Harding also maintained close relationships with figures who later became central in major ethics controversies. The Teapot Dome scandal, in which Interior Secretary Albert Fall received secret payments from oil companies in exchange for access to federal reserves, showed how easily some officials could be influenced when oversight was weak. Harding died before the full story was publicly understood, but the episode unfolded during his administration, within an environment shaped by relaxed boundaries and backroom familiarity. Stories about Harding's romantic life added another layer of privacy and rumor. Claims about meetings with Nan Britton and others sometimes placed parts of that story near the White House itself. The historical evidence is debated, but the broader point remains. Private behavior, if revealed in the moment, can change public trust quickly. And when the White House hosts both formal state events and deeply private encounters, it highlights how thin the line can be between public duty and personal desire. John F. Kennedy brought a new style to the White House in the early 1960s, a fresh public image celebrated by many. The press highlighted his youth, his family, and the elegant cultural presence of Jacqueline Kennedy. At the same time, accounts and later reporting described a private life that did not always match the polished public narrative. Some meetings were arranged away from cameras and moved through back corridors, service routes, and quieter entrances. Staff members, according to many accounts, worked to maintain schedules and privacy. The issue wasn't simply personal choice, it was the role secrecy played in preserving a carefully crafted image for the country. By the 1990s, the media landscape had changed dramatically, and the ability to keep personal matters contained became far more limited. When President Bill Clinton developed an inappropriate relationship with a young White House intern, Monica Lewinsky, within the White House environment, it eventually became a national controversy. The relationship involved private encounters in spaces near the Oval Office and adjacent areas. Clinton initially denied the relationship in direct terms, but later acknowledged it after detailed evidence emerged. Impeachment proceedings followed in the House, focused on statements made under oath and questions about cooperation with investigations. He was later acquitted in the Senate, but the episode left a lasting impact on public trust and on how Americans viewed the boundaries of behavior inside a workplace that ultimately belongs to the public. People will interpret that history in different ways, some as personal failure, others as an imbalance of power and responsibility in a workplace. Either way, the setting matters. These were not distant private places. They were steps away from the symbolic center of government. And not all challenges came from people on the inside. Some came from outside in ways that revealed the building's very real vulnerabilities. On September 19, 2014, Omar Gonzalez, an Iraq War veteran dealing with serious stress-related health challenges, climbed the fence at the north lawn and ran across the grass toward the White House. Despite efforts to stop him, he reached the building. Reports later described that an entrance meant to be secured was not fully secured in that moment. He entered and moved deeper than many people expected before he was stopped. Early official statements suggested a shorter path, but later reporting clarified the extent of the breach. It also emerged that an alarm had been muted because staff had grown tired of frequent alerts. That incident was not only about one individual. It raised concerns about routine complacency, how small shortcuts can appear in any workplace, even one tasked with extraordinary security. Other unusual breaches over the years, including incidents involving aircraft and unexpected landings nearby, have reminded the public that total safety is more fragile than it appears. Each time something like this happens, the country is briefly reminded that the White House is not only a symbol. It is also a physical structure with human systems and human errors. Beyond physical threats and personal controversies, there is another dimension that shapes the history of this building: the pressure it places on the people inside it. Lyndon Johnson entered the White House during a national tragedy and used his authority to push major civil rights legislation and ambitious social programs. But as the war in Vietnam expanded, the protests outside the gates intensified. Johnson spent long nights reading reports, following casualty figures, and calling advisors. Witnesses described him as increasingly exhausted, tense, and worn down by the constant conflict between policy, public reaction, and the human cost of war. The building around him remained grand, but the atmosphere within it often carried the weight of relentless decisions. Richard Nixon also changed under mounting pressure. In the final months of his presidency, as the Watergate investigation tightened, staff members observed him becoming more isolated and erratic in mood, swinging between determination and deep worry. He argued with aides late into the night and walked the halls as if searching for an exit from a tightening narrative. The White House, which can feel like a fortress when things go well, can feel like a maze when the walls begin to close in. And in Nixon's case, those walls held phones, meetings, and recordings, proof that could not be argued away if it existed in full. In that context, the missing minutes on a tape became even more meaningful, because it suggested a desperate desire not merely to survive a controversy, but to shape what history would be able to confirm. In recent years, the White House has also become a stage for more visible conflict between government power and public protest. During demonstrations over racial justice in 2020, law enforcement and federal personnel cleared Lafayette Square, just north of the building, in a forceful way that sparked intense public debate. Reports also stated that the president was briefly moved into a protected underground area as security concerns rose. The moment triggered arguments about whether the response was primarily about safety, symbolism, or public messaging. It also reminded many Americans that the White House can feel very different depending on where you stand, inside the fence or outside it. When you watch footage of crowds pressed against barriers and lines of armed personnel on the grounds, you can't help but think about the phrase, "the people's house." For some, it represents national unity and shared ownership. For others, especially in moments of conflict, it can look like a fortress, shut tight, guarded, and distant. All of these episodes connect back to a set of simple realities. The White House is not just a pretty building. It is a working engine of authority, image, and decision-making. The people who occupy it have strong incentives to highlight what helps them and to downplay what could damage confidence. Fires that nearly destroyed it were followed by rebuilding and a restored public image. Structural danger was handled with controlled messaging while leaders worried about how the story would look. A president's medical crisis was managed privately while a close inner circle controlled access and information. Underground spaces were built to protect leaders, but they also allow critical decisions to happen out of public view. Intrusions exposed gaps, only for fuller details to emerge later. Major controversies like Watergate and Iran-Contra centered on records, tapes, papers, memos, that were delayed, disputed, edited, or eliminated within the orbit of the White House itself. If you step back, you can see a repeating pattern. A difficult or embarrassing event occurs. The first instinct inside the building is not complete openness, it is control. Information is curated. Damage is contained. The immediate story is simplified. Only later, sometimes much later, does a fuller version emerge through hearings, reporting, archives, and memoirs. And by then, the people who made the earliest choices may be out of office, while the building remains, holding their legacy like fingerprints under fresh paint. The White House has endured enemy attack, internal decay, ethical controversies, and public anger. It has housed leaders driven by ideals and leaders driven by fear of failure. It has witnessed moments of bravery and moments of weakness. It stands today as a powerful symbol because the country needs it to. Yet its history also suggests how much strain and complexity can hide behind a smooth image. So the next time you see the familiar front of the White House on a screen or in a photograph, you may notice it differently. You may think of the burned ruins of 1814 beneath the bright exterior. You may remember the weakened beams that Truman's reconstruction had to replace. You may recall Wilson lying in private while access to power was carefully managed. You may picture the bunker under the East Wing, prepared for an emergency that the public might not fully see in real time. You may remember the shredded papers tied to Iran-Contra, the missing minutes on the Nixon tape, the personal controversies, the security breaches, and the presidents who felt the building's pressure in ways the public could only guess. The White House is often presented as the clean center of American democracy, orderly, dignified, and stable. But the fuller story is more complicated. It is a place where leaders have managed health information, tightly controlled records, and made high-stakes choices away from the immediate eyes of the people they serve. It contains a long record of how authority behaves under stress, how institutions protect themselves, and how history is shaped not only by events, but by the story that survives those events. In the end, the White House is both a symbol and a lesson. It reflects what a country wants to believe about itself, and it also reveals what a country sometimes chooses not to look at too closely in order to keep that belief intact. And once you know that, you can decide which side of the story you notice first when those familiar white walls appear again.